My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The blue light from Pastor Mark's computer monitor glowed in the dark, empty office, making the stacks of theology books look like strange, sleeping animals. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was just the volunteer who came in on Thursday nights to tidy up the children's ministry closets. A quiet task for a quiet person, but I'd seen his office door ajar, the light on, and thought I'd just pop my head in to say the supply list was done. He wasn't here, but his computer was on, humming softly, and an instant message box was blinking brightly in the center of the screen. It was from someone named Lydia. And the words, they were not about sermon prep or hospital visits. They were intimate, desperate. A secret language of the heart that spoke of a meeting last Tuesday, of missing his touch, of how hard it was to pretend on Sundays. The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. I stumbled back, my hip hitting the edge of his desk, sending a pen holder clattering to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the holy silence. This couldn't be real. Pastor Mark and Heather, our leaders. The couple whose marriage was the stable shore we all looked to in our own rocky seas. He baptized my daughter. He held my hand at my father's funeral last year and prayed with a strength I could only cling to. And now this poison on the screen, this unraveling of everything I thought was solid. I stood there, frozen, the cold from the truth seeping into my bones. My faith, which already felt fragile, like a thin pane of glass, didn't just crack. It shattered into a million useless pieces right there on his expensive rug. This was the moment everything changed. But to understand how I got here, I need to take you back to where it all began. My name is Alice McCain. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Up until that moment in the pastor's office, I would have told you I was a believer, but if I'm being honest, my faith had been running on fumes for a long time. It started with my dad's cancer. We prayed. Our whole small group prayed. The church prayed. We anointed him with oil. We claimed scripture, and he died anyway. A hard, painful death that left my mom a ghost, and me, angry, quietly, deeply angry at a God who seemed to listen to everyone else's prayers but mine. After that, church became a duty. I went for my husband, Brian, who still found comfort there, and for our 16-year-old Jake, and our 12-year-old Lily. I showed up, I sang the songs, I drank the terrible coffee in the fellowship hall, but my heart was a stone. I did the volunteer work because it was expected, because it filled the time, and because, in a way, I was hoping to stumble upon the faith I'd lost. Like maybe it was hiding in a closet behind the unused VBS crafts. Before I continue, I'd love to know where are you watching from. Drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments. It means the world to me to know who's hearing this story. Pastor Mark had been at Cedar Hills Community Church for about 8 years. He was in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a laugh that made you feel included. He wasn't a fire and brimstone guy. He talked about grace a lot. He'd say things like, God meets you in your mess. And I'd sit there in my pew thinking, my mess must be invisible then. His wife, Heather, led the women's Bible study. She was warm and put together, the kind of woman who remembered your kids' names and always brought the good homemade cookies to potlucks. They seemed like a unit, a team. It was one of the few things about the church I didn't actively doubt. That Thursday started like any other. Brian was working late at the auto shop he manages. Jake was at soccer practice. Lily was at a friend's house. The silence in our own home felt heavy, so I drove to the church to tackle the supply closet. It was a tornado of glue sticks, mismatched Lego pieces, and felt cutouts of Noah's Ark animals. I lost myself in the mindless sorting, the angry prayers I sometimes whispered turning into just nothing, a blank static. I finished around 8:30. The main hallways were dark, but I saw the slice of light from under Pastor Mark's office door. I figured I'd give a quick wave, let him know I was leaving. The door was open a few inches. I knocked softly. Pastor Mark? No answer. I pushed the door open a little more, just to tell the empty room I was heading out. And that's when I saw the glow of the monitor. The church was so quiet I could hear the old building settling. I took a step in, meaning to just turn off the light. My eyes flicked to the screen, and I read it. I keep replaying Tuesday. I know it's wrong, but it feels more real than anything else in my life. Can we see each other again before the weekend? I need to see you. The sender's name was Lydia. The chat history below was a gut punch of stolen moments, lies to Heather, and whispers of a love they called a miracle in the desert. I felt sick. Physically, stomach-churningly sick. This wasn't just a shock. It was a violation. This man from this sacred desk, in this sacred place, had been preaching to us about integrity while living a double life. The hypocrisy was a taste of metal in my mouth. My initial fear of being caught in his office melted into a white-hot rage. Who was he to counsel Brian and me through our rough patch last year? Who was he to stand up there every Sunday and talk about the light of Christ? He was a fraud. And if he was a fraud, what did that make everything else? I heard a noise in the hallway, a door closing. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. I backed out of the office, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't turn off the light. I just fled down the dark hallway, my shoes squeaking on the polished floor, out the side door into the cool Iowa night. I sat in my minivan for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. What was I supposed to do now? Go home to Brian and pretend nothing happened? Tell someone and blow up our entire church? Confront Pastor Mark and watch him lie to my face? The rage began to curdle into a bitter, dark satisfaction. Finally, here was proof. Proof that it was all a show. That my silent suspicions about shiny, happy church people were right. If the shepherd was this lost, what hope was there for the rest of us sheep? I drove home in a fog, the blinking words seared onto the back of my eyelids. I had found my pastor's secret, and that secret, I was sure, was the final nail in the coffin of my dying faith. I pulled into our driveway, the headlights washing over Brian's old pickup truck. The normal sight of it, with its McCain auto decal on the door, felt like an anchor to a world that had just tilted off its axis. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark, watching the kitchen light glow yellow through the window. I could see Brian moving around, probably loading the dishwasher. A normal Thursday night. How was I supposed to walk in there and be normal? I must have sat there too long because the porch light flicked on, and the front door opened. Brian stood silhouetted in the doorway, his frame solid and familiar. "Alice? You okay?" he called out. The sound of his voice, concerned and ordinary, broke something in me. I felt a sob rise in my throat and I choked it down, hard. I couldn't tell him. Not like this. Not when I was shaking apart. I took a deep, ragged breath, grabbed my purse, and got out of the van. "Yeah," I said, walking toward him, my voice strangely high. "Just tired. That closet is a black hole." He studied my face as I climbed the steps. Brian is not a complicated man. He's steady. A mechanic who believes most problems can be solved with the right tools and enough patience. He's also deeply observant. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, putting a hand on my shoulder. I flinched. His touch felt like a brand after what I'd just seen. After the intimate words on that screen, I forced a smile. "Just the dust bunnies. They're monstrous." I slipped past him into the house, the warmth and smell of baked chicken almost nauseating. "Jake's in his room, Lily's asleep," Brian said, following me into the kitchen. "Left you some dinner." "Thanks," I mumbled, pouring myself a giant glass of water just to have something to do with my hands. They were still trembling slightly. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "How's Pastor Mark? I saw his car when I drove by earlier." The question was a knife twist. I took a long drink, buying time. Didn't really see him, just dropped off the list. The lie tasted sour. I, who was so furious about deception, was now weaving my own. "Huh." Brian was quiet for a minute. "Heather called today. Asked if you'd be interested in helping with the new women's retreat planning committee. Said she thinks you have a great eye for detail." A bitter laugh almost escaped me. Heather. My heart ached for her. Did she know? Was she living in a nightmare of suspicion? Or was she blissfully ignorant, baking her cookies and planning retreats? The injustice of it all was a fire in my chest. "I don't think so," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Brian just nodded. He knew my faith had been cold since Dad died. He never pushed. Just quietly kept going himself, like a reliable engine. Sometimes his steadiness felt like a comfort. Right now, it felt like a canyon between us. I picked at the chicken, unable to eat. My mind was a chaotic reel. Lydia. Who was she? Someone in the church? Someone from town? The secret knowledge felt like a weight, a poisonous sack I had to carry alone. Later, in bed, with Brian breathing softly beside me, I stared at the ceiling. The rage had settled into a cold, hard stone in my gut, but underneath it, to my surprise, was a devastating grief. I hadn't realized how much I'd still clung to Pastor Mark's faith, how I'd used his certainty as a crutch for my own doubt. Now the crutch was splintered, and I was falling all over again. I thought about just leaving the church. It would be easy, a clean break, but the stone of anger in my gut wanted more. It wanted exposure. It wanted the shiny, happy facade to crack in front of everyone. I imagined standing up in the middle of a service and shouting the truth. The fantasy was vivid and satisfying for a moment, until I pictured Lily's confused face, Jake's embarrassment, Brian's shocked disappointment. A scripture verse, one I hadn't consciously recalled in years, floated, unbidden, into my mind. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Luke 8:17. It felt less like a comfort and more like a threat. A promise of coming chaos. The next few days were agony. Sunday was a special kind of hell. Walking into the sanctuary felt like walking onto a stage for a play where I was the only one who knew the lead actor was a fraud. The music started, and there he was, Pastor Mark, up on the platform, smiling warmly, opening his Bible. His voice was as calm and sure as ever. He preached from Ephesians 4 about living a life worthy of the calling, about speaking the truth in love. I felt my hands clench into fists in my lap. The hypocrisy was so thick I could barely breathe. I watched Heather, sitting in her usual spot in the third row. She was nodding along, occasionally writing a note in her journal. She looked peaceful. My eyes scanned the crowd. Was Lydia here? Was she watching him, sharing this terrible secret while the rest of us sang? Every woman between 30 and 50 became a suspect. Brian reached over and took my clenched hand, gently prying my fingers open to hold it. His simple, loving gesture was the final straw. A hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. I wasn't crying for me, or for Mark, or even for Heather. I was crying because the last safe place felt poisoned, and I had no idea what to do. After the service, we were funneled toward the doors with the usual slow-moving crowd. Pastor Mark stood at his post, shaking hands. "Brian! Alice! Good to see you," he said, his grip firm, his eyes meeting mine directly. "Heather told me she called you about the retreat. Hope you'll pray about it." His gaze was clear, his demeanor so utterly normal that for a split second, I doubted my own memory. Had I imagined it? Had I misunderstood? But the words were burned into me. "I need to see you." "We'll see," I managed to say, pulling my hand back too quickly. Jake and Lily were already heading to the car. Brian got stopped by a deacon about a muffler. I stood alone for a moment in the bustling foyer, feeling utterly disconnected. That's when I saw her, a woman I knew only vaguely, named Lydia Collins. She was in her late 30s, a quiet woman who sometimes helped in the nursery. She was standing off to the side, not moving toward the door, her eyes fixed on Pastor Mark as he laughed with another family. Her expression wasn't adoring or spiritual. It was intense, private, and full of a longing that turned my stomach. My breath caught. Lydia. It was her. The puzzle piece clicked into place with a sickening finality. She must have felt my stare because her eyes suddenly shifted from Pastor Mark and locked onto mine. For a held second, we looked at each other across the crowded room. In her eyes, I saw a flash of panic, then a defensive hardness. She knew that I knew. The unspoken acknowledgement passed between us like a lightning strike. She turned abruptly and disappeared into the flow of people heading to the parking lot. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. The secret was no longer just mine. It was a silent, screaming thing between me and Lydia Collins. And as I watched her go, a new, terrifying thought crystallized. What if I wasn't the only one who had discovered it? What if this house of cards was already starting to fall, and I was just standing in the path of the collapse? The weight of the knowledge, and the fear of what was coming, settled on my shoulders. I couldn't carry this alone anymore. But who could I tell? And what would happen when I did? The cliffhanger of discovery was over. Now I was dangling over the precipice of what to do next, and the ground beneath me was crumbling fast. The silent exchange with Lydia Collins in the church foyer looped in my mind all week. That panicked, hardened look in her eyes was a confirmation louder than any words. It chased me through grocery aisles, interrupted me while helping Lily with homework, and sat like a third, unwanted passenger in my minivan. The secret was now a shared, malignant thing, and it felt like we were both holding our breath, waiting to see who would break first. I became a detective in my own life. And a terrible one at that. I found myself driving past the church on evenings when I had no reason to be there. Just to see if Mark's car was in the lot, I scrolled through the church directory online, staring at Lydia's smiling photo with her husband, Rob, and their 2 young boys. They looked normal, happy. Another family about to be wrecked. The weight of it was suffocating. Brian noticed my distraction. "You're a million miles away, Al," he said one night over meatloaf. "Everything okay at work?" I worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small dental office, a world of numbers and invoices that suddenly felt blessedly simple. "Just busy," I lied, pushing my food around my plate. "Tax season stuff for the dentists." Another lie, stacking up like dirty dishes. "Mom's acting weird," Jake announced, not looking up from his phone. At 16, he had a radar for atmospheric shifts in the house, even if he interpreted them through the lens of his own teenage world. "I am not," I said too quickly. "See? Weird," he said, shoveling a forkful of potatoes into his mouth. Lily, ever the peacemaker, changed the subject to a school project. I smiled gratefully at her. My sweet girl who still believed in the basic goodness of things. The thought of her finding out about Pastor Mark, about the duplicity at the heart of a place she trusted, made me feel physically ill. I had to protect my kids from this. But from what, exactly? The truth? Or the fallout when the truth eventually exploded? The following Thursday rolled around again. My volunteer night. All day, my stomach was in knots. I couldn't face going back to that church. I couldn't risk seeing the blue glow of that computer monitor, or running into Lydia in a silent hallway, or worse, having Pastor Mark try to make cheerful conversation with me. The hypocrisy was a taste I couldn't stomach again. So, for the first time, I called in sick. I phoned the church office and left a vague message for the ministry coordinator about a migraine. I spent the evening on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, pretending to watch a home renovation show while my mind tore itself apart. What was the right thing to do? The question was a drumbeat in my skull. Go to the elders? The thought made me shrivel inside. They were all men who played golf with Mark. They'd likely dismiss me, or worse, turn it around and question why I was on his computer. Confront Mark directly? My courage failed at the thought of his calm, pastorly gaze dismissing my misunderstanding. Tell Heather? The idea of being the one to shatter that woman's world felt monstrous. I was trapped in a prison of knowing, and the warden was my own fear and indecision. Saturday morning, I was pushing a cart through the supermarket, moving on autopilot. The canned vegetable aisle was a monument to normalcy I couldn't connect to. Then I turned the corner into the cereal section, and there she was. Heather. She was comparing 2 boxes of granola. A slight frown of concentration on her face. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair in a messy ponytail. She looked tired, but ordinary, human. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had about half a second to decide, duck down the baking aisle, or face her. Before I could flee, she looked up and saw me. A warm, genuine smile spread across her face. Alice! Hi! Heather! Hi. My voice sounded strangled. I gripped my cart handle like it was a life preserver. I'm so glad I ran into you, she said, putting the granola in her cart. I wanted to apologize if my call about the retreat felt like pressure. I see you serving so faithfully in the background, and I think you have a lot of wisdom to offer. She leaned in a little, her voice softening. And between you and me, I could use a friend on that committee who isn't already entrenched in church politics. Her words were a knife. She was asking me for friendship, for help, while her husband was betraying her in the most intimate way possible. The kindness in her eyes was unbearable. I felt like a fraud standing there holding my secret. I'm just really stretched right now, I mumbled, looking at the colorful boxes of sugar cereal aimed at children. With family, and everything. Of course, she said immediately, her face full of empathy. No explanation needed. Just know the offer stands, okay? And how is your mom doing? I think of her often, she remembered. While her own life was presumably a private hell she didn't even know about, she remembered my grieving mother. The sheer, cruel injustice of it all rose in my throat. This good woman was living a lie, and I was letting her. She's getting by, I managed. Day by day. Heather reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was warm. It's a long road. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. You're a good daughter, Alice. She gave my arm a gentle squeeze. Well, I'd better get this circus on the road. Mark has a men's breakfast tomorrow and I promised I'd make his famous cinnamon rolls. She rolled her eyes playfully. Famous for how many I make, not how good they are. She pushed her cart away, humming a little hymn tune under her breath. I stood frozen, watching her go. Famous cinnamon rolls. She was going home to bake for the man who was destroying her. The image was so profoundly sad, so ordinary and tragic, that it broke through the cold stone of my anger. For the first time, I didn't just feel rage at Mark. I felt a crushing, aching sorrow for Heather. The rage had been fuel. This sorrow was a weight. It pinned me there between the Cap'n Crunch and the Raisin Bran. I wasn't just holding a secret about a sinner. I was holding a secret about a victim. I drove home in a daze, Heather's kind face superimposed over the memory of those blinking words on the computer screen. The two realities refused to merge. When I walked into the house, Brian was in the living room, watching a football game. "You're back early?" he said, muting the TV. "Everything okay?" The concern in his voice, the normalcy of the scene, was the final straw. I couldn't hold it inside anymore. The secret was a poison, and it was killing me from the inside out. I had to tell someone, or I would shatter into 1,000 pieces. I looked at my husband. This good, steady man who believed in fixing things. I took a deep, trembling breath. "Brian," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I need to tell you something." Something terrible happened at the church. His expression shifted from casual concern to focused attention. He clicked the TV off entirely. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. "What is it, Alice? Did someone hurt you?" "No," I said, tears welling up. "Not me." I sank into the armchair across from him, my legs unable to hold me. "It's about Pastor Mark." I saw the confusion, then the dawning apprehension in his eyes. And then, with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears, I told him everything. The open door, the glowing monitor, the messages from Lydia, the look in Lydia's eyes at church, the encounter with Heather today. It all spilled out in a rushed, chaotic torrent. When I finished, the room was silent again, but now it was a heavy, loaded silence. Brian just stared at me, his face pale. He ran a hand slowly over his jaw. "Alice, are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice low. "I mean, absolutely sure? This isn't just, I don't know, something taken out of context?" His doubt, however gentle, sent a fresh wave of desperation through me. "I read it, Brian. It was a private chat. It was about meetings, about touching, about lying to Heather. How much more context do you need?" My voice was rising, edged with hysteria. Okay, he said, holding up a placating hand. He looked shell-shocked. "I believe you. I can't process it." He stood up and paced to the window, looking out at our quiet street. "This is a bomb, you know that, right? If this comes out—" "I know!" I cried. "What do you think I've been carrying around? I'm sick with it. But I can't just pretend. Not after seeing Heather today. What do we do?" He turned to face me, his mechanic's mind already moving to practicalities. "We don't do anything. Not yet. This is too big for us. We need to pray. We need to, I don't know, talk to someone wiser." "Who?" I challenged. "The elders? They're his friends. Then maybe we go to another pastor. In another town? For counsel." He was trying to be the fixer, but this was a problem with no clear schematic. "And what about Heather?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me. "Does she deserve to live in this lie while we pray and get counsel?" Brian had no answer. He just looked at me, his own faith simple, sturdy, and untested by this kind of betrayal clearly reeling. The person he looked to for spiritual guidance was the one who had created this crisis. We were adrift. The secret was out in the open between us, but that only made it heavier, because now we both had to decide what to do with it. The weight of the decision pressed down on us, thick and smothering. Later that night, long after we'd gone to bed lying stiffly back to back, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short, and it turned my blood to ice. "We need to talk. It's about Mark. Don't tell anyone. Lydia." I stared at the glowing screen in the dark. My breath caught in my chest. The secret had just reached out and tapped me on the shoulder. The other holder of the truth was done waiting, and she was coming for me. The text from Lydia glowed in the dark like a live wire. I didn't reply. I just stared at it until the screen went black, my mind racing. Don't tell anyone. It was a threat wrapped in a plea. She knew I had told someone. She had to. Why else reach out now? Or maybe she was just as terrified and isolated as I was. For 2 days, I carried my phone like a hidden grenade. Brian knew about the text. He'd been adamant. "Don't meet her alone, Alice. We don't know what she wants. This could get messy." His protective instinct was in overdrive, but it was laced with a nervousness I rarely saw in him. The solid ground of his faith was quaking, and it scared him. But I couldn't not reply. The silence was its own kind of scream. Finally, on the second evening, while Brian was in the shower, I typed back, my fingers clumsy with tension. "What do you want?" The 3 dots appeared immediately. She'd been waiting. "To explain. To make you understand. Please. The grocery store parking lot. Tomorrow night. 7:30. Far side by the recycling bins." It was specific. Secluded. It felt like a spy movie, not my life in Cedar Falls. I thought of Heather's tired, kind face in that very store. I thought of the wreckage that was coming, and I knew I had to go. "I'm meeting her," I told Brian as he came out of the bathroom, a towel around his waist. "I have to." He argued. He pleaded. He said we should call an elder together first. But I held firm. "I need to hear it from her," I said. "Before we blow up everything, I need to understand why." It wasn't entirely true. Part of me wanted to look the other woman in the eye and unleash the fury I'd been carrying. Another part, a smaller, quieter part, was just desperately curious. What story could possibly make this right? Brian finally relented on one condition. "I'm driving you. I'll stay in the truck. You're in my line of sight the whole time. If anything feels off, you wave and I'm there." The next night, under a cold, clear sky full of stars that felt mockingly eternal, he did just that. He parked his pickup at the far end of the grocery lot, facing the row of green recycling bins. Lydia's sensible silver SUV was already there, idling. My mouth was dry. 15 minutes, Brian said, his jaw tight. "Then I'm coming over." I just nodded, unable to speak. I got out and walked across the asphalt. The air smelled like spilled soda and car exhaust. The mundane setting made the whole thing feel even more surreal. I reached her passenger door. It unlocked with a soft click. I got in. The interior was clean, smelling of lemon disinfectant and kids' car seats. Lydia Collins looked older than she did on Sundays. In the dim light of the dashboard, I could see fine lines around her eyes, a tightness in her mouth. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice flat. I said nothing. The anger was a hot ball in my chest. But seeing her like this, a tired mom in a messy minivan, not some seductive villain, threw me off. "I know what you think of me," she began, still not looking at me. "I doubt that," I said, the words sharp. Finally, she turned her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "You think I'm a homewrecker? A sinner. A hypocrite. And you're right." The admission was so blunt it stole my breath. "But it's not. It didn't start the way you think." "It never does," I shot back, parroting a line from a talk show I'd once heard. She flinched. "Rob and we've been in a bad place for years. Empty. Just co-parenting, going through the motions." Her story tumbled out, halting and raw. She'd started counseling with Mark a year and a half ago. After her father died. Grief counseling. He'd been so compassionate, so present. He listened in a way Rob hadn't in a decade. The boundaries, she said. Slipped away slowly. A hug that lasted too long after a session. A private text of encouragement. A shared coffee when he said he was checking in. He said I was seen, that I was beloved, she whispered, a tear tracing down her cheek. He said God's love was fierce and specific and that he felt a specific calling to minister to my wounded heart. She let out a shaky, bitter laugh. I know how it sounds. I'm not stupid. But when you're that lonely, and someone with that much authority, that much light around them, tells you you're special, you believe it. I listened, my anger morphing into a complicated, ugly stew of emotions. I heard my own loneliness in her words, the years of feeling invisible to God, of going through the motions. The gap between public faith and private struggle she described was a canyon I knew well, but she had jumped into it with our pastor. So it's his fault? I asked, my voice quieter now. No. Yes. I don't know. She wiped her cheek. I'm responsible. I knew it was wrong. But he made it sound like a secret blessing, a well of water in a dry land. He used scripture. Alice. He used Isaiah to justify us. The blasphemy of it landed like a physical blow. He had taken the very words meant to point to God and twisted them into a tool for seduction. My rage found a new, clearer target. Mark, not just as a betraying husband, but as a shepherd poisoning the sheep. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Do you want me to keep your secret? She looked at me then. Truly looked at me. Her eyes wide with a fresh panic. No. The secret's over. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the lemon-scented air. The final, irreversible consequence. The secret that could no longer be hidden. Lydia, I breathed, all my judgment momentarily swallowed by the sheer scale of the disaster. Rob doesn't know. Mark does. She started to cry in earnest. Silent, shoulder-shaking sobs. He's scared. He says we need to be wise. He's talking about options, or me telling Rob the baby is his. But I can't do that. I'm breaking. I'm so tired of the lies. She was trapped. By Mark's cowardice, by her own sin, by the life growing inside her. The other woman in my head vanished, replaced by a terrified, drowning person. What do you want from me? I asked, feeling utterly helpless. I don't know, she cried, her voice cracking. You're the only one who knows who isn't him. I needed to tell someone who would actually understand the weight of it. The church weight of it. You know what this will do. I did. I saw it all. The shattered families, the gossip, the headlines, the kids at school asking Jake and Lily if it was true their pastor got someone pregnant. The total collapse of our community. He has to confess, I said, the words leaving my mouth with a certainty that surprised me. You can't carry this alone and he can't hide it. He'll lose everything, she whispered. He already has, I said. And the truth of it was stark. He lost it the first time he decided his feelings were more important than his vows and his calling. We sat in silence for a moment, two women in a car surrounded by recycling bins, holding the fragments of a broken ministry between us. I'm going to tell Rob, she said, her voice firming with a desperate resolve. This week. And then, I think I have to tell an elder. For the church. I can't let him spin this. She was going to blow the whistle. The bomb was in her hands, and her finger was on the button. My 15 minutes were up. I saw Brian shift in his truck across the lot. I have to go, I said. Alice, she said as I opened the door. I'm sorry. For all of it. For dragging you into this mess. I just nodded, unable to offer forgiveness, unable to condemn. I got out and walked back to Brian's truck on shaky legs. He took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. He just started the engine and drove us home. That night, lying awake, the image of Lydia's terrified face wouldn't leave me. The secret was no longer an abstract betrayal. It was a pregnancy. It was a desperate woman and a cowardly pastor. It was about to become a very public scandal. And then, a new, chilling thought occurred to me. Lydia said she was going to tell an elder. But what if Mark found out she was planning to expose him first? What if the shepherd, cornered and facing the loss of everything, decided to protect himself by silencing the sheep? The danger I felt was no longer just emotional or spiritual. It felt suddenly, terribly real. The secret had led us all into the shadows, and I no longer knew what the man in the light was capable of. The fear that Mark might do something drastic took root in my mind and grew like a thorny vine. I watched crime shows. I read the news. I knew how people with perfect reputations could unravel when faced with exposure. The man I'd seen preaching about grace was also a man who had lied to everyone who loved him for over a year. What lines wouldn't he cross to protect his life? I shared my fears with Brian the next morning over cold coffee. He listened, his brow furrowed, but shook his head. Mark's not a violent man, Alice. He's a coward and a liar, sure, but I can't see him hurting Lydia. That's a bridge too far. You didn't see her face, I insisted. She's not just scared of shame. She's scared of him, of what he'll do to control this. Then we go to the police, Brian said, his voice firming with a new resolve. And say what? Our pastor is having an affair and we're worried he might be upset about it? The impossibility of it all was maddening. We were trapped in a spiritual crisis that had no earthly protocol. In the end, we decided on a middle path. Brian, using his most non-confrontational tone, called Mark's cell. He said we needed to talk, that it was urgent, and that it was about a pastoral care issue concerning someone in the church. He was careful, vague. Mark's voice on the speakerphone was all warm concern. Of course, Brian. Let's meet tomorrow after the evening service. My office. The plan was feeble, but it was something. We would sit in that office, beneath the framed degrees and the cross on the wall, and Brian would gently, firmly, tell him that the secret was known, that Lydia was planning to come forward, and that he needed to do the right thing before he was forced to. We would become the reluctant messengers of his impending downfall. Sunday arrived, a day that once meant peace, and now felt like the calm before a storm. The service was a blur. Mark preached on forgiveness, from the parable of the unmerciful servant. He talked about the astronomical debt forgiven by the king, and the petty refusal of the servant to forgive a small debt owed to him. We who have been forgiven much, he said, his voice thick with emotion, must forgive others from the heart. I felt sick. Was this a performance? A manipulation? Or was it the cry of a drowning man who knew the weight of his own debt? I couldn't tell anymore. The words which might have once comforted me now felt like weapons. After the final hymn, Brian squeezed my hand. Wait here with the kids. I'll be back. He walked toward the pastor's office, his shoulders set with a determination I rarely saw. I hovered in the foyer with Jake and Lily, making mindless chatter with other members, my eyes constantly flicking to the hallway that led to the office. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Lily got bored and went to find her friends. Jake slid down the wall to look at his phone. After 30 minutes, the office door opened. Brian emerged, alone. His face was ashen, his expression unreadable. He walked toward me, not meeting anyone's eyes. Let's go home, he said quietly, gathering Jake with a look. What happened? I asked in the van, once the doors were shut. Brian was silent for a long moment, staring out the windshield. He denied it, he said, his voice flat. At first, said Lydia was unstable, that she'd developed an unhealthy attachment during counseling, that she was fantasizing. My mouth fell open. He denied it? After what I saw? I told him you saw the messages. That's when he changed. Brian's hands tightened on the wheel. He broke down, Alice. Full on, sobbing on his knees breakdown. He confessed to everything. The emotional affair, the physical meetings, the pregnancy. He said he's been living in hell, that he wants to repent, to make it right. A sliver of something pity, maybe pricked at my heart, but it was quickly smothered. So what does making it right look like to him? Brian let out a long, weary breath. He begged me for time, a week. He says he needs to tell Heather himself the right way, to get into intensive counseling, to prepare a confession to the elders. He says if we go public now, it'll be a circus and it'll destroy any chance of true repentance and healing for everyone. And you believed him? The words came out sharper than I intended. I don't know what I believe, Brian snapped, a flash of frustration breaking through his calm. I saw a broken man. I've never seen anyone cry like that. He was pathetic. He kept saying, I've forfeited it all, I know I have. Just please let me try to clean up the mess I made in the least destructive way possible. We drove the rest of the way home in heavy silence. Brian, I could tell, was swayed by the raw display of remorse. He wanted to believe in redemption, even for this, but all I could think about was Lydia, sitting in her car, pregnant and terrified. Did she get a week? Did her pain get put on a schedule for Mark's convenience? The agreed-upon week of silence was the longest of my life. I jumped every time the phone rang. I scanned local news for any tragic reports. I prayed for the first time in months, but my prayers were chaotic. Angry whispers. Protect Lydia. Don't let him smooth this over. Make someone do something. On Wednesday, I saw Heather. She was walking into a cafe downtown. On impulse, I parked and followed her in. She was sitting alone at a small table by the window, staring into a cup of tea. Her Bible open but unread beside her. The peaceful woman from the grocery store was gone. In her place was someone who looked hollowed out, her eyes ringed with shadows. She didn't see me. I watched as she picked up her phone, looked at it, put it down, picked it up again. Her finger hovered over the screen, trembling. She was holding a secret, too. The secret of her husband's distance, his strange absences. The unnameable fear growing in her gut. She was in the anteroom of devastation, sensing the earthquake coming but not yet feeling the ground break. I couldn't go to her. My promise to Brian, and even my grudging acquiescence to Mark's plea for time, held me back. But in that moment, I hated myself for my complicity. I was allowing this woman to sit in lonely, silent agony so her husband could stage manage his confession. The week was up on Sunday. Brian and I had barely spoken about it, the tension a wall between us. Sunday morning dawned gray and drizzly. We drove to church, but this time, I knew the storm wasn't outside. It was waiting behind the sanctuary doors. The service began normally. The music team played. We sang. But the atmosphere was different. The usual rustle and chatter was subdued. A nervous energy hummed in the air. Mark was on the platform, but he wasn't smiling. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Heather was not in her usual seat. After the final song, Mark stepped to the pulpit. But he didn't open his Bible. He gripped the sides, his knuckles white. The room grew utterly still. Before I give the sermon this morning, he said, his voice raspy and amplified by the microphone. I have something I must say to all of you. He took a shuddering breath. I have sinned. Profoundly. I have been unfaithful to my wife, Heather. I have violated my marriage covenants and my pastoral vows in a prolonged, secret relationship. A collective, gasped inhale swept through the room. Someone behind me whispered, "Oh Lord." Mark's confession was bare, blunt, and devoid of excuses. He named his pride, his lust, his deceit. He did not name Lydia, protecting her identity for now. He announced he was resigning, effective immediately, and submitting to the discipline of the elder board. He told us he had broken Heather's heart and betrayed our trust. I am so desperately sorry, he choked out, tears streaming down his face. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to it. I only ask you to pray for my family, for the other family I have harmed, and for this church that I have wounded. It was the most horrifying and spiritually authentic thing I had ever witnessed. The perfect pastor was gone, and in his place stood a shattered sinner. The facade was finally, completely, gone. People were crying. Some looked angry. Others stared in stunned silence. Jake leaned over to me, his teenage cynicism replaced by wide-eyed shock. Mom? Is this for real? Before I could answer, a commotion erupted at the back of the sanctuary. The doors swung open. Lydia stood there, her face pale but set like stone. And beside her, his arm around her shoulders, face etched with a pain so deep it was frightening, was her husband, Rob. They had come. Together. Mark saw them from the platform. His confession had been prepared, but this their public, united arrival was not part of his script. His eyes met Rob's across the crowded room. Rob Collins. A quiet electrician I barely knew spoke, his voice clear and cutting through the silence. "You forgot to confess the pregnancy, Mark." And in that searing, terrible moment, as the full truth landed on the congregation with the force of a physical blow, I saw not just the ruin of a man, but the end of the church as I knew it. The secret was out, the fallout was beginning, and I was standing right in the middle of the debris field, with no idea how any of us would ever find our way through. The silence after Rob's words wasn't really silence. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the huge room, leaving only the static of pure shock. Then it broke into 100 pieces, muffled cries, sharp whispers, the scrape of a chair as someone stood up too fast. My own hands flew to my mouth. I hadn't expected this. I thought Lydia might tell an elder in private. This was a nuclear detonation in the middle of the sanctuary. Mark stood frozen at the pulpit, all his prepared remorse wiped away by sheer, unvarnished terror. He looked at Rob, then at Lydia, his face a mask of betrayal. He was betrayed? The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. A hysterical bubble that died in my throat. Lydia didn't look at him. She was staring at the floor, leaning into Rob's side. Rob held her, his face a monument to furious, devastated love. He had chosen, in this cataclysmic moment, to stand with his broken wife against the man who had broken her. It was the most Christ-like thing I had seen in that building in years, and it was coming from the cuckolded electrician, not the pastor on the stage. An elder, Gary, a kind-faced man in his 60s, rushed to the front, his steps heavy with dread. He took the microphone from Mark's limp hand. This is a time for prayer, not for further," he faltered, his voice trembling. "The service is concluded. Please, go to your homes. Pray. The elders we will communicate." It wasn't a dismissal. It was a merciful scattering. People moved like sleepwalkers, gathering coats, shepherding confused children. No one spoke. The unspoken rule was to get out before the tears or the anger could no longer be contained. Brian's arm was around me, guiding me toward the aisle. Jake and Lily were pressed close, their faces pale and bewildered. "Is Pastor Mark going to jail?" Lily whispered, her voice small. "No, honey," Brian said, his voice thick. "But he's done a very bad thing." As we shuffled toward the doors, I saw Heather. She was standing off to the side, partially hidden by the sound booth. A woman from the prayer team had an arm around her, but Heather was staring straight ahead, dry-eyed, looking at nothing. She was a statue of grief. She had heard her husband's confession, and then minutes later, learned it was even worse than he'd said. The double blow had left her shell-shocked. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. There was no recognition in hers, only a vast, empty pain. I quickly looked away, shame scalding me. I had known. I had given him the week. I had let her walk into this ambush. The ride home was a morgue. Jake stared out the window. Lily cried quietly. Brian drove, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. When we got home, he went straight to the garage, the door closing behind him with a final thud. The kids vanished into their rooms. I stood alone in my kitchen, the church bulletin still in my hand. The printed order of service seemed like a relic from a lost civilization. "Welcome," it said cheerfully at the top. I let it fall to the floor. The following days were a blur of awful quiet. Brian called into work. We moved around each other like ghosts. The television constantly on for noise but never watched. The phone rang incessantly, friends from church, no doubt, but we let it go to voicemail. We weren't ready to process this with anyone else. Our own faith was in pieces on the floor. On Tuesday evening, the doorbell rang. We all flinched. Brian went to answer it. It was Gary, the elder, and his wife, Marilyn. They looked exhausted. We sat in the living room, the air stiff with formality. "We're checking in on key families," Gary said, his hands clasped between his knees. "This has been devastating. We're forming a crisis team." "What about Lydia?" I asked, the question bursting out of me. "And Heather?" Marilyn's eyes filled with tears. "Heather is with her sister. She's shattered. Lydia and Rob are meeting with a counselor we've brought in. It's fragile." She leaned forward. "Alice, Brian, Mark told us you were the ones who confronted him. He said you gave him the chance to confess. That took courage, and it may have prevented him from spiraling further. I didn't want their gratitude. It felt dirty. We didn't do it for courage. We did it because we were backed into a corner. Gary nodded slowly. Sometimes that's where God does his best work. In the corners. He sighed. The church is splitting. You should know that. Some are leaving, saying the leadership is corrupt. Others are rallying, saying we need to show radical forgiveness. It's becoming a battle of camps and, well, you're in the middle of it. People know you knew first. A new kind of dread settled over me. We weren't just witnesses. We were now characters in the scandal. After they left, Brian finally spoke what we'd both been thinking. We can't go back there, Alice. The finality in his voice broke something loose in me. Where do we go then? Is there a church out there that isn't full of sinners? Because if there is, I doubt they'd let us in. It was a bitter joke, but it held a kernel of my struggle. Where do you run when the problem isn't the institution, but the human heart? A heart that beats in pastors, elders, electricians, and bookkeepers alike. That Friday, I couldn't stand the walls of the house anymore. I told Brian I was going for a drive. I ended up at the one place I thought would be empty. The church parking lot. It was late afternoon, the sky the color of old bruises. The building looked different now, not a sanctuary, but a crime scene. I was about to drive away when I saw a figure sitting on the low brick wall by the memorial garden. It was Heather. She was alone, wearing a simple coat, her hands tucked in her pockets. She was just sitting there, looking at the empty flagpole. Every instinct told me to drive away. I had nothing to offer. My presence was a reminder of the whole ugly mess, but something stronger pulled at me. I turned off the engine and got out. She heard my footsteps on the gravel and looked up. Her eyes were red and puffy but clear. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "Hi, Alice," she said, her voice hoarse. "Hi, Heather." I stood awkwardly, a few feet away. I'm so sorry." She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. "Everyone is." She patted the brick beside her. "You can sit." I sat. The cold of the stone seeping through my jeans. We sat in silence for a long minute, watching a few dried leaves skitter across the pavement. "Did you know?" she asked softly, not looking at me. The question I'd been dreading. I couldn't lie to her face. "For about a week and a half. Before he told you." She absorbed this, nodding slowly. "I thought so. The way you looked at me in the grocery store. It wasn't just pity. It was guilt." She turned to me. "Why didn't you tell me?" The tears came then, hot and shameful. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. "Brian and we confronted him. He begged for a week to tell you himself. We were trying to do the right thing, the wise thing. And I was so angry at him, at the church. I think part of me wanted him to have to face it. I'm sorry. It was cowardly. You deserved to hear it from someone who cared about you first." To my surprise, she reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "It's okay. If you'd told me, I wouldn't have believed you. I needed to hear it from him. I needed to see his face." She took a shaky breath. "The worst part isn't the other woman. It's the 1,000 little lies. The fake smiles. The sermons on integrity he wrote while planning to see her. The way he held me and whispered prayers while his heart was somewhere else." She looked at the stark, empty church. "He didn't just cheat on me. He cheated on all of you. He sold us a product he wasn't using." Her clarity was devastating. She had lost her husband, her best friend, her ministry, her community, and her worldview in one blow. And yet, she was sitting here, holding my hand. "What will you do?" I whispered. "I don't know," she said. "Breathe. Maybe that's enough for today." She let go of my hand and stood up. "Thank you for sitting with me, Alice. It's less lonely out here now." She walked to her car and drove away. I sat on the cold wall for a long time after she left. The bitterness I'd been nursing, the anger at the hypocrisy. It didn't have anywhere to land anymore. It was met by Heather's profound, quiet grief. My rage felt small and selfish in comparison. As dusk settled, a single, clear thought emerged from the chaos. The church wasn't the building, or the pastor, or even the people in their failure. It was Heather, offering grace to the woman who failed her. It was Rob, standing by his broken wife. It was the ugly, painful, unvarnished truth finally seeing the light. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't a revival. It was a funeral. But for the first time in years, it felt real. I drove home as the streetlights flickered on. When I walked in, Brian was in the kitchen making spaghetti. A simple, normal task. He looked at me, worry in his eyes. "I saw Heather," I said. "At the church." "How is she?" "Broken," I said. "But alive." I took a breath. "I don't think we should leave the church." He stopped stirring, surprised. "After everything?" "Because of everything," I said, the conviction growing as I spoke. "Where else would we go to see something this hard? Where else do people have to face the consequences of their sin and maybe, just maybe, find a way through? I'm not saying it's going to be easy, or that we should stay for the gossip or the drama. But maybe we stay for the funeral, and to see if anything can grow out of the dirt afterward." Brian studied me, and I saw a flicker of the old, steady hope in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll stay, for now." It felt like a decision, but a fragile one. We had chosen to remain in the wreckage, but as I helped him set the table, a new fear crept in. We were choosing to stay in a community torn in two. The battle lines Gary mentioned were being drawn, and by choosing a side, the side of staying, we were inevitably choosing against others. The fallout wasn't over. It was just entering a new, more complicated phase, and I had no idea which friend, which familiar face from the pews, would become an adversary in the painful, confusing war of forgiveness and judgment that was about to begin. Staying, as it turned out, wasn't a quiet decision. It was a declaration of war, in a conflict I didn't understand. The following Sunday, we returned to a church that felt physically smaller, the walls pressing in on the fractured congregation. Only about half the usual crowd was there. The air was thick with a tension no worship song could dispel. An elder I didn't know well, Phil, gave a short, somber talk about God being our refuge and strength. He prayed for all those affected, careful not to name names. It was like watching someone try to bandage a gaping wound with a single strip of gauze. After the service, the divisions became clear. In one corner of the fellowship hall, a group huddled around Gary, their faces earnest, talking about restorative justice and bearing one another's burdens. In another corner, a larger, louder group surrounded a man named Steve, a longtime deacon. His voice carried absolute betrayal of trust. He doesn't get to just resign and go to counseling. There needs to be accountability. Public sin, public consequence. I stood by the coffee urn, feeling invisible and yet hyper-visible. Karen, a woman I'd known for years from the women's Bible study, marched up to me, her eyes blazing. "Alice, Brian, we heard you knew. Why didn't you go to the elders immediately? This could have been handled discreetly, with wisdom. Now look at this circus." Before I could form an answer, Brian stepped slightly in front of me. "Karen, with all respect, it wasn't our secret to handle discreetly. It was Mark's sin to confess. Our role was to urge him to do that." "You urged him right into a public meltdown," she snapped, then lowered her voice. "Heather's life is ruined. That poor girl's life is ruined. And it's partly on your hands for how you managed it." She turned and walked away, leaving me feeling branded. Steve from the deacon corner ambled over next, clapping Brian on the shoulder. "Don't you listen to her, Brian. You did the right thing. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need to purge this and start fresh. Clean house." His tone was almost gleeful, a hunger for righteous demolition in his eyes. "We're forming a group to ensure true accountability happens. No soft peddling. We'd value your perspective. Since you were on the front lines." Brian removed his shoulder from Steve's grip. "We're not joining any groups, Steve. We're just trying to be here." Steve's smile faded. "Neutrality helps the oppressor, Brian. Remember that." We left quickly, the taste of coffee and conflict sour in my mouth. In the car, Brian slammed his palm against the steering wheel. "A purge? A circus? We're not a political party, we're a church. We're a family," Lily said softly from the back seat. "And families fight sometimes." She'd been listening, absorbing it all. Jake scoffed. "This is worse than a fight. This is stupid. Why are we even going? Pastor Mark was a fake. The whole thing's a joke." "Jake." Brian warned, but his heart wasn't in it. The foundation he'd built his quiet faith on had not just cracked, it had revealed itself to be sand. I could see the doubt haunting him, too. That week, the phone calls became more pointed. Invitations to accountability meetings from Steve's faction. Pleas for unity and grace gatherings from Gary's side. We declined them all, which only seemed to make both sides view us with suspicion. We were adrift in our own church. A church that was now two camps, sizing each other up across a no-man's land of donuts and doctrinal statements. My anger, which had once had a clear target in Mark, now splintered and flew in all directions. I was angry at Karen for her judgment, at Steve for his bloodlust, at the elders for their helpless flailing, at Mark for creating this mess, and at God for allowing his people to be such a miserable, messy spectacle. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I found myself alone in the house, the silence oppressive. In a fit of restless frustration, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the bookshelf and pulled out my old Bible, the one from my teenage years with a peeling floral cover. I didn't open it with reverence. I opened it like a prosecutor looking for evidence, flipping past the highlighted verses about hope and peace, searching for something that fit the rubble of my life. My eyes landed on the Psalms. Not the pretty ones. The ugly ones. Psalm 55. I started reading, and my breath caught. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house we walked in the throng. The words were written thousands of years ago. But they were my story. It was Mark, my pastor, my spiritual guide, the betrayal from within the house of God. David, the king after God's own heart, knew this feeling. He'd felt this specific, religious brand of devastation. I kept reading, my heart pounding. My heart is in anguish within me. Horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, that was it exactly. The overwhelming horror, the desperate wish to escape. The Bible wasn't offering a platitude. It was mirroring my despair back to me, acknowledging its depth and truth. This wasn't a Sunday school lesson. This was a raw scream in a holy book. I read through the psalmist's cry for justice, his desire for his betrayer to be caught. I felt that too. But then, near the end, a shift, a fragile, weary turning. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. It wasn't a magic fix. It didn't say the burden would vanish. It said he will sustain you. He would hold me up under the weight. The promise wasn't for the burden to disappear, but for me not to be crushed by it alone. I closed the Bible, tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of sadness or anger this time. They were tears of a strange, weary recognition. I wasn't alone in this feeling. God, if he was there. Wasn't shocked by the hypocrisy or the infighting. He'd seen it all before. He'd inspired poems about it. That night I told Brian about reading Psalms. He listened, then said, Steve called again. They're calling for a special business meeting to vote on dissolving the elder board for negligence. The spiritual intimacy I'd felt evaporated, replaced by cold reality. The war was escalating. They can't do that, can they? They're going to try. It's in Robert's Rules of Order or something. He rubbed his face. Gary called too. He asked if I'd consider serving as an interim elder. To help bridge the gap. I stared at him. You? Why? Because I'm not in either camp, apparently. And because I saw the sin up close. He thinks that might give me perspective. Brian looked terrified. I said no, I'm not qualified. My faith is hanging by a thread, Alice. But the ask had been made. It meant that in the midst of the chaos, someone had seen something in my husband, his steadiness, his reluctant integrity that the church needed. The thought was frightening, but it was also a tiny, glowing ember in the dark. A few days later, I was checking the mail when I saw a familiar car slow down on our street. It was Rob Collins's truck. He pulled into our driveway. My heart leapt into my throat. He got out, looking uncomfortable. He wasn't in his work clothes, just jeans and a jacket. Alice, he said with a brief nod. Is Brian around? He's in the garage. I led him back, my mind racing. Was he here to blame us? To shout? Brian looked up from organizing his tools, surprised. Rob, come on in. Rob didn't sit. He stood awkwardly among the shelves of motor oil and tools. I won't take much of your time, he began, his voice rough. I wanted to thank you. Brian and I exchanged a glance. Thank us? I asked. Lydia told me about meeting you in the parking lot. That you were decent to her. That you didn't scream or judge her to her face. She said you told her Mark had to confess. He cleared his throat, his eyes shining. After she told me everything, I wanted to kill him. I wanted to. Then I wanted to pack up my boys and leave this town and this God-forsaken church forever. He looked at the concrete floor, but knowing that someone else saw it, that someone else made him face it. It helped. It helped me feel less crazy, and it helped me choose to stay with my wife. He looked up at us, his gaze direct and full of pain. We're leaving the church. We found one across town where nobody knows us. We need to heal. But before I left, I wanted to say thanks. You were the only ones who acted like Christians in this whole damned thing. He shook Brian's hand, nodded at me, and left as quietly as he came. We stood in the garage for a long time after his truck pulled away. Rob's words, "You were the only ones who acted like Christians," should have felt like a comfort. Instead, they felt like the heaviest indictment of all, because it hadn't come from a place of strength. It had come from our own flailing, fearful, reluctant actions. We hadn't been wise or brave. We'd been cornered and confused. But maybe, a tiny voice whispered inside, that's where it starts. Not with the perfect faith, but with the stumbling, guilty, groping in the dark. The special business meeting was scheduled for the next Tuesday night. The email blast made it sound like a corporate takeover. The future of the church hung on a vote. Brian, despite his refusal, was being pulled into back-channel conversations by both sides, seen as a potential swing vote if they could sway him. On Monday night, as we were trying to distract ourselves with a movie, the doorbell rang again. It was late, Brian answered. It was Mark. He stood on our porch, a shell of the man he'd been. He'd lost weight. His clothes hung on him. He held a battered baseball cap in his hands, twisting it. Can I come in? He asked, his voice barely audible. I know I have no right, but I need to say something. Brian, after a long pause, stepped back to let him in. Mark stood in our living room, not looking at the pictures of our family on the walls. He looked broken. Yes, but also strangely clear-eyed. The performance was gone. What was left was hollowed out and raw. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. Not forgiveness, not understanding. I'm here because tomorrow night, the church I loved is going to tear itself apart because of me. And you two are caught in the middle. He finally looked at me. Alice, you saw the secret. That secret. It was my hell. But God, in His mercy, is using it. It's burning away everything that wasn't real in me. It's burning away everything that wasn't real in the church, too. He took a shuddering breath. I'm moving away. Heather and I are separating. She may never forgive me, and I don't deserve it if she does. I am submitting to every bit of discipline the elders prescribe. But before I go, I need to tell you this. That secret you found, it led you to the cross. I stiffened. What? The cross isn't a shiny symbol? He said, his eyes burning with a painful intensity. It's the place where the worst of humanity and the greatest love of God collided. It's where sin is exposed in all its horror. You saw the sin. You've been forced to look at it, to smell it, to taste it. And now, he looked between Brian and me. Now you have a choice. You can let it destroy your faith, or you can let it lead you to the only place that sin can be dealt with. The cross, where Jesus took the weight of all of it, my deceit, Lydia's loneliness, the church's gossip, your anger. It's all there. He put his cap back on. I'm the last person who should be preaching to you. But I had to say it. I am so sorry for the pain I caused you, for making you carry my guilt. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Brian and I stood in the silent living room. The movie credits rolled unnoticed on the TV. Mark's words hung in the air, not as a pastor's slick sermon, but as a scarred confession from the foot of the gallows. The secret had led me to the cross, not to a pretty gold-plated necklace cross, but to the rough, bloody, real one. The question now, as we faced a church meeting that felt like a gladiatorial arena, was what would I do there? Would I stand at a distance in my anger? Or would I take a step closer, toward the agonizing, mysterious love that claimed to meet sinners in the very worst of their mess? Tomorrow night, the battle for the church would be fought with votes and rhetoric. But my battle, I realized, was happening right here, in my own living room, in the quiet of a heart that had seen the worst and was being asked, gently, relentlessly, to consider a love that was deeper still. The night of the business meeting, the parking lot was full. It felt like a funeral and a riot at the same time. Brian and I walked in together, not speaking. We'd talked for hours after Mark's visit, circling around his words like they were a fire we couldn't quite touch. That secret led you to the cross. It sounded profound. But my life still felt broken. The church still felt sick. The sanctuary was set up with rows of chairs facing a lone table where the remaining elders sat, Gary among them. They looked like men awaiting a sentencing. The room was divided, just like the fellowship hall had been. Steve's faction sat on the right, arms crossed, agendas printed on their laps. Gary's supporters sat on the left, some with tissues in hand. A few families, like ours, sat in the middle, the no man's land. Gary opened with a prayer that pleaded for wisdom and grace. It was immediately met with a muttered "Amen" from the left, and stony silence from the right. Then the arguing began. Steve stood, quoting church bylaws and talking about biblical qualifications for leadership and the failure of oversight. Someone from the left stood and wept, talking about the body of Christ being broken and in need of binding up, not amputating. It was theology as weapon, and theology as bandage, clashing in the air above the pews. I listened, but the words started to blur. I looked at the faces. I saw fear masquerading as righteousness. I saw pain disguised as piety. I saw simple, unvarnished hurt. I saw my own reflection in the window, tired, confused, and so very far from any kind of victory. Then Steve said it. "We need to vote now to dissolve the current elder board and appoint an interim committee to rebuild from a foundation of integrity." Shouts of agreement and cries of "No!" erupted. Gary tried to gavel for order, but the sound was swallowed by the noise, and that's when I saw her. Heather. She slipped in through the back doors and stood against the wall, her presence rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped in water. The noise dimmed to a shocked hush. She wasn't in hiding. She was dressed simply, her face pale but composed. She walked to the front of the room, not to the elders' table, but to the space beside it. She turned to face us all. "I have something to say," she said, her voice clear and carrying without a microphone. "If you'll allow me." No one dared to speak. She looked out at us, her gaze moving across the divided room. "My family is broken. My heart is broken. The man I loved and trusted most in the world betrayed me, and he betrayed all of you." She paused, swallowing hard. "For the past weeks I have been angry. I have been devastated. I have asked God why more times than I can count." She looked down at her hands, then back up, her eyes finding mine for just a second before moving on. "I have also been listening. I've listened to the calls for justice. I've listened to the calls for grace. And I've realized something. You're all arguing about what to do with the institution, how to fix the church. But Mark didn't cheat on the church. He cheated on me. He lied to you, to individuals, to people." She took a step forward. "So I'm here to tell you what I am doing. I am choosing to forgive him." A gasp went through the room. Steve looked furious. "I'm not saying what he did was okay. It was evil. I'm not saying we'll ever be married again. That trust is gone. And my forgiveness doesn't remove his consequences. He will not be a pastor here, or anywhere. Ever again. He has lost that." Her voice trembled but held. "But I am forgiving him because my bitterness is a prison, and Jesus set me free. He forgave me a debt I could never pay, so I am, by his strength, forgiving a debt that feels impossible to forgive." She looked at the elders. "I am not asking you to reinstate him. I am asking you to be the church. Stop fighting over power and procedure. There are people drowning in shame, in gossip, in hurt. Be the lifeguards, not the judges." Finally, she looked directly at the congregation. "Some of you will leave after this. I understand. But for those who stay, Can we please stop tearing at the wound? Can we just sit in the silence together and maybe, just maybe, let it start to heal? She didn't wait for applause or argument. She simply walked back up the aisle and out the doors. The silence she left behind was profound, heavy with conviction and shame. Steve stood up, but his bluster was gone. He just shook his head and sat down. Gary wiped his eyes. Then, a man from Steve's side, Ron, a hard-faced guy who'd been nodding along with every call for dissolution, stood up. He cleared his throat. My son is an addict, he said, his voice rough. We've been hiding it, pretending at church, because we were afraid of this. He gestured to the divided room. Maybe we need to be a place where people can fall apart without being finished off. One by one, then, short, halting confessions spilled out. A woman admitted her marriage was hanging by a thread. A teenager stood and cried, saying she'd been cutting herself and felt too ashamed to ask for prayer. A man confessed he'd been faking his tithing numbers for years. It wasn't orchestrated. It was messy and raw and utterly real. The factions dissolved into a room of sinners, all exposed under the same light. No vote was taken. The meeting ended not with a gavel, but with people hugging, crying, praying in small clusters. The building wasn't fixed, but the facade was finally, completely gone. Brian and I drove home in a different kind of silence. It wasn't tense. It was full. When we got inside, he didn't turn on the TV. He just sat at the kitchen table. "Heather," he said, shaking his head in awe. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "It cost her everything," I whispered. "It gave her everything," he replied. "She's free." The next morning, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I drove to the church, but not to the building. I went to the memorial garden where Heather had sat. The morning was crisp and clean. I sat on the same cold brick wall. And for the first time since finding that secret on the screen, I prayed. Not a prayer of demand or accusation, just 3 words, over and over, from the depths of my worn-out soul. "God, help me." As I sat there, a picture formed in my mind. Not of a shining cross on a hill, but of the rough, splintered wood, stained and ugly, and I saw myself, not kneeling prettily before it, but nailing my own things to it. My anger at Mark, my judgment of Lydia, my bitterness towards the church, my disappointment in God for my dad's death, my pride in thinking my doubt was special. I saw myself hammering it all onto that terrible, wonderful wood, and I felt, not a voice, but a knowledge settle in my spirit. It is finished. The debt of my anger was paid. The cost of everyone's sin was covered, not erased, not ignored, but accounted for. At the cross, Heather was right. The cross was where the worst of us met, the greatest love. My pastor's secret had forced me to stare at the worst in him, in the church, in myself, and in doing so, it had left me with nowhere else to look but at that one, central, awful, beautiful place, where God himself absorbed the blow. I didn't feel fireworks. I felt a deep, quiet, settling, like a bone that had been long dislocated finally sliding back into its socket. A peace that didn't make sense. A week later, a letter arrived, with no return address. The handwriting was Heather's. "Alice. I'm moving to Kansas to be near my sister for a while. I needed to write to you. Thank you for sitting with me on the wall. In that moment, you were the church to me. Just a silent presence in the pain. That mattered. Mark's secret was a fire. It burned my life down. But I am finding in the ashes a faith that is real. It's small, like a green shoot, but it's mine. Not his, not the church's, mine, and it's enough. Maybe that's what the secret was for, to burn away what wasn't real for all of us. I'll pray for you and your family as you rebuild in the burned-over place. Sometimes the most fertile ground is the one that's been through the fire. With hope, Heather." I held the letter to my chest. The secret had led me to the cross. And the cross, I was starting to understand, was always leading to resurrection. Not the kind that looks like your old life restored, but the kind that starts quietly, in the dark earth, with a single, fragile seed of grace. On Sunday, we went to church. It was thinner, quieter. Gary preached, haltingly, about new beginnings. We sang, a little off-key. After the service, I didn't hover by the coffee. I walked up to Karen, the woman who'd blamed me. I touched her arm. "How are you?" I asked simply. She looked startled, then her eyes filled with tears. "Not good," she admitted. "Me either," I said. And we stood there, two women in a broken place, not fixing anything, just acknowledging the brokenness together. It was a start. As I walked back to Brian, I looked at the plain cross hanging at the front of the sanctuary. It wasn't a symbol of how good we were. It was a monument to how loved we were, even at our worst. My pastor's secret had shown me my own heart, and the cross had shown me his. The road ahead was long. The church was wounded. My faith was tender. But for the first time in a very, very long time, I was home.